Okay, welcome back. Let's continue our discussion of pangenome graphs, and today we are going to specifically look at the problem of sequence alignment to pangenome graphs. Now, I have frequently shown this figure during the course where I have mentioned that during genome resequencing there is a requirement of aligning a set of reads to a reference genome. So, we refer to this problem as read mapping, where we are given a large number of reads, we do approximate pattern matching of those reads to the reference, and based on the alignment based on the differences in the alignment we figure out where are the mutations happening in the target genome. So, for example, in this figure, I am showing you an example where there is a indication of a mutation from T to A in the target genome. So, that is how these read mappings are being used. But observe that in this illustration I am showing you a reference genome which is represented as a sequence, right. So, we discussed that the role of pangenome graphs is to improve the reference representation, so that we can use a collection of genomes together. Now, if you remember the way we are aligning these reads to the reference genome, so this is equivalent to comparing a short pattern to a long text. So, here we are doing approximate pattern matching of a short pattern to in a long text. So, how would you formulate this problem? Well, we have seen this kind of problems in the previous lectures, where you can think of this problem of read mapping as a scenario where you are given a reference genome text as input. So, this is a string of length n, and let us say you are given another short string which is read q of length m. So, one way to formulate the read mapping problem is to say whether there is a substring r dash of r such that the edit distance between r dash and q is less than equal to k, where k is some threshold. So, that is to say that is there a substring in the reference genome such that the edit distance of that substring against my read is less than equal to some threshold value. So, if there is a substring, then we know that okay, then there is an approximate occurrence of that read at r dash in the entire reference genome R. So, we have, so for example, here is another example. So, here is an example shown at the bottom where you have a reference genome R and a short query read Q, and let us say the threshold k is 3. So, then the question to you is there a substring inside this reference genome where such that the substring has a edit distance of less than equal to 3 with the query read. Now, in this example it turns out that yes, there is a substring of the reference genome which has 3 edits with the query read. So, in this case you can see that the 3 edits are 1 substitution and 2 so these are 2 deletions in the query read. So, yes, in this example it turns out that the answer is yes. So, this is how we can formulate this problem when you are doing approximate pattern matching of a short string against a long string. However, in the context of the problem that we want to look at, we are considering the problem of mapping reads now to a pangenome reference which is represented as a graph. So, recollect again that pangenome reference can be represented as a graph, a directed graph where vertices are labeled with strings. So, then the question is how do we formulate the problem of mapping reads to a graph like structure as shown below. So, in the following few slides let us try to formulate this problem precisely of how do we map these reads to a pangenome graph. As a first step, let us define the pangenome graphs. So, we will define this pangenome graph as a directed graph GV. So, GV comma E comma sigma, where V denotes the set of vertices in the graph, E denotes the set of edges in the graph, and function sigma labels each vertex in set V with a character from the DNA alphabet. So, an example is shown below. This is a directed graph where each vertex is labeled with a character. Now, you may ask, okay, why are we considering character labels? Because in the example shown below, some of the vertices are labeled with strings as well. But observe that it is trivial to convert this graph to a character labeled vertex to character labeled graph as well. So, for example, the simple way to convert this into a character labeled graph would be to split this vertex into 5 vertices, G followed by C followed by T followed by A followed by T, and the incoming vertices can be attached to G and the outgoing vertices can be attached to the final vertex. So, this is to say that basically we are splitting. So, if you have a vertex labeled with a string, you can split it into multiple vertices such that each vertex is labeled with a character. So, from a definition perspective, we can define these Pangenome graphs as character labeled graphs in which each vertex is labeled with a character. Okay. So, now that we have defined these Pangenome graphs and we will be using this notation G, V, comma E, comma sigma for denoting these Pangenome graphs, let us move forward to understand how we can do read mapping on these Pangenome graphs. So, when we want to do sequence to graph alignment, that is, informally we can say that the sequence to graph alignment problem can be phrased as we are given a pattern string P and a big graph G. We are required to find a walk in the graph that best matches the pattern. So, this is the informal definition for now. So, basically we are looking for a walk in the graph that best matches the given pattern. So, as an example, let us say that my pattern is ACG TC, then I have to look for a walk that best matches the pattern. Now, in this particular example, there is no walk that spells exactly ACG TC, right. So, there is no walk in this graph which directly spells ACG TC. However, if I am allowing approximation, so that is if I am allowed to do edits, then observe that I can delete one character in the pattern and then there is a match in the graph. So, if I delete or I edit this one character in the pattern, then I have a walk in the graph such that AGTC matches AGTC of the pattern. So, here we can say that yes there is an approximate occurrence of the pattern in the graph and there is a need to make a change in the pattern, so that I can delete one character in the pattern and then you can find the exact match in the graph after deleting this one character. So, this is an informal overview of what we are looking for when we are solving the sequence to graph alignment problem. That is, we are looking for approximate occurrences of this pattern as a walk in the graph. Now, this is no informal definition because we have still not defined what this best means, and to define this problem mathematically we have to give a proper definition of what this word best means. So, now there are multiple ways. So, first thing we have to figure out is what is the metric that we are going to use. For example, we could use Hamming distance, which is just counting the number of substitutions that we do in the walk, or we could consider edit distance where we are allowed to do insertion, deletions as well as substitutions. Then another question is, when we are doing this matching, are we allowed to do change in graph or are we doing changes in the pattern or both? Now, for example, in the previous example I showed you, here observe that we can make a change in the pattern, that is we deleted a character C and then we are able to match the pattern as a walk in the graph. So, here one change was done in the pattern, that is we deleted the character C, right. So, the question is, are we doing these such changes in the graph or pattern or both, because we are doing approximate matching. So, we have to make some changes either in the graph, pattern or both, so that the pattern can match. And third question is, what graph type are we considering, because that will also change the problem complexity. So, is the graph cyclic or is the graph acyclic? We will see why this matters in the next few slides. For now, let me also discuss this point further, that is, why does it matter where the changes happen? Because so far when we were discussing the edit distance concept, we said that it does not matter whether you are doing edits in the pattern or the text, because if I am doing an insertion in the pattern, then accordingly I can do deletion in the text as well. So, this is a symmetric operation, but unfortunately this symmetry is lost when we are considering graphs. Let me show you one example. So, let us say the pattern is AG and your graph is containing two vertices connected as a cycle. So, the vertex A is connected to vertex C, and then vertex C has an edge to vertex A back. So, now observe that when we are doing approximate pattern matching, the number of changes required will depend on whether you allow me to change the graph or the pattern. For example, if you just tell me that I am only allowed to make a change in the pattern, then I will have to substitute G characters with C characters, and only then there is a walk in the graph such that I can spell the walk spells the pattern. So, now there is a walk in the graph AC that exactly spells the pattern after I have made the changes. However, if you allow me to change graph as well, then observe that I can make a single change. I can make a single change in the graph here. So, I can convert the vertex C to vertex G, and then just with a single change I can find a walk in the graph that spells exactly the pattern. So, that is A G A G, right. So, basically this is to illustrate a technical detail that the problem will differ, the problem definition will differ depending on whether we are allowing changes in the graph, pattern or both. So, let us look at all these problem versions and let us look at what are the known results in the literature. So, on one axis I am showing you the different options, that is whether we are allowing changes in the graph, whether we are allowing changes in the graph and pattern alone, and similarly what is the distance metric I am considering, whether is it Hamming distance or whether I am considering eddy distance. So, these are the known results. If I consider acyclic graph, that is my graph does not have any cycle, in that case in the literature we know that this problem can be solved in order m v plus e time, where m is the pattern length and v and e denote the vertex and edge set respectively. So, basically the sequence to graph alignment problem, if you have a acyclic graph, can be solved in order m v plus e time for all these different versions of the problem. So, it does not matter whether you are doing changes in the pattern, graph or both, and similarly if you considering Hamming distance or eddy distance, I can address all these problems in order m v plus e time. I will discuss some of the details in the next slides. Let us consider the case of cyclic graph, that is when the graph has cycles. So, when your Pangenome graph has cycles as well, then the results are slightly different. As it turns out that, so if it turns out that if you are allowing changes in the graph or graph and pattern both, then in this case the problem is NP hard, that is for this specific problem cases we do not have fast algorithms. Whereas if you are allowing changes in the pattern alone, then in this case we have a fast algorithm, that is a polynomial time algorithm, which requires order m v plus e time. So this is quadratic runtime depending on the pattern length and your graph size. So these are the known results, and this is just to illustrate that there are a variety of problems depending on what metrics we allow and where we allow the changes. So going forward, let us discuss some of these problem versions in more detail. So let us start diving deeper into the algorithms. So let us start with the acyclic graph, and let us start solving the sequence alignment to acyclic graph first. We will fix the metric as eddy distance, and we will say that the changes are only allowed in pattern. Although in the case of DAGs it does not matter because there is symmetry holds for DAGs, but let us focus on this specific problem version. So we can formulate this problem as following. So given a pattern P and a Pangenome DAG, that is a directed acyclic graph DAG, we have to determine whether there is a path in the DAG such that the eddy distance between the string spelled by the path and the pattern P is less than equal to k. So k is a threshold here, that is a user defined threshold, right. So we have to determine whether there is a path in the DAG such that the eddy distance between the string spelled by that path and the pattern P is less than equal to some threshold. So how do we solve this problem? Now we have reached a well defined problem, and observe that we have seen some versions of this problem before, except that instead of a graph we had a long text before. So if I replace this graph with a text, then we have seen how to solve this problem, but now we have a DAG that we are working with. So we have seen dynamic programming algorithms for pairwise sequence alignment where both inputs are strings. The same ideas can be extended to DAGs as well. Let us see how. So just to recollect the old concept, that is when we were discussing the approximate pattern matching problem in one of the earlier lectures, both inputs were strings. You had a pattern, short pattern, and a longer text T. There we had asked the problem statement, is there a substring T dash of T such that the eddy distance between P and T dash is less than equal to k. An example is shown on the below. So this is the same example that we used earlier, that is if this is the pattern and this is the text. So then indeed, so we are saying that is there a substring T dash of the text such that the eddy distance between T dash and the pattern is small. So for this problem we had discussed how to use dynamic programming. So remember that we had identified a sub problem, that is we said that instead of solving the main problem, let us solve these sub problems. So these sub problems are defined as determining minimum eddy distance between prefix of the pattern that ends at I and a suffix of text from position 1 to j over all suffixes of T1 to j. So this is to say that instead of solving the problem for entire pattern at once, we will look at the prefixes of the pattern first, and then we will incrementally solve these solutions recursively, so that until we align the entire pattern. So Cij here was defined as a minimum eddy distance between prefix of the pattern and suffix of the text that were ending at position j. So here we were considering, so Cij reflects, so you can pick any suffix of T1 to j, that gives the minimum edit distance, right. So, we solved for these Cij values using recursion, and recollect that each value depended on 3 neighboring cells. So, each cell depended on its upper value, upper diagonal and left value. The final answer was given by the maximum value, or sorry, the minimum value in this case, because we are solving the edit distance. So, the final value will be given by the minimum value in the last row. So, this topic we have already covered. Let us see how we can extend this topic to graphs. So, in our case we have a pattern and a directed acyclic graph. How do we extend the same concept to DAGs? So, now we will extend the same concept, but with while making some small modifications. So, now we will define this notation CIV, where CIV denotes minimum edit distance between the prefix of the pattern and a text suffix in the DAG which ends at vertex V. So, we are considering all suffixes, all text suffixes in the DAG which end at specific vertex V, and that is how I am defining my sub problem and computing this value CIV. So, what all text suffixes end at vertex V? Well, one suffix is G itself, then another suffix is AG, another suffix is TAG, and then another suffix is CTAG, because there is a path from A to G, then there is a path from T to A to G, and then there is a path CTAG in the graph. However, observe that there is one more incoming edge. So, G has one more incoming edge to C. So, therefore, G will also be a suffix that ends at vertex V. So, depending on the incoming neighbors of vertex V, we will have to spell out all the text suffixes accordingly, and among those text suffixes we will be looking for which of those text suffix gives the minimum edit distance between the prefix of pattern and a text suffix. So, over all possible choices. So, we have considering all over all choices, which of these choice results in the minimum edit distance. So, this is how we are defining CIV, which is the extension of the previous concept, except that now we are looking at the text suffix which end at particular vertex in the DAG. So, now how do we move forward? Well, observe that if we solve CIV recursively, then the final answer will be given by CMV over all V in vertex at V. So, remember that M was the length of the pattern. So, once we have aligned the complete pattern, then the alignment must end at some vertex. So, basically we can look for all values V and find out. So, this should be the minimum. So, there is an error here. So, this should be minimum CMV over all V in V, because we are solving the minimum edit distance. So, here we are minimizing the cost. So, if we are solving this dynamic programming, then once we have aligned the entire pattern, we can look for the vertex which results in the minimum cost. Okay. So, now moving forward, we can extend the recursion. So, remember that what is the base case for this dynamic programming? So, we can solve these CIVs recursively. Let us consider the base case first. What should be C0 comma V? This is to say that what is the edit distance between empty string from the pattern and a text suffix in the DAG which ends at vertex V. Well, we can take an empty suffix, and we know that the edit distance between two empty strings is 0. So, therefore, the base case is easily determined as 0 for all vertices V. Now, in general, if for I greater than 0, how do we solve for CIV? Well, again remember we can apply the same concept, that is we can look at how the alignment is ending between the prefix of the pattern and the text suffix ending at vertex V. So, let us look at all the ways in which the alignment can end, and let us say the last column of the alignment is involving the alignment of pattern ith character of the pattern to a dash symbol. So, in this case observe that we have to recurse and say that how did we align the previous I minus 1 characters until, and how did it align ended at vertex V. So, for that we can say that we have to go to C I minus 1 comma V, and then we have to add 1 cost because of the alignment between pattern to the dash symbol, because this is a, so this is equivalent to inserting, making an insertion in the pattern. So, this is costing 1 edit. Now, if there is a match mismatch, that is if the pattern I has a match or mismatch to the character at vertex V, then we have I minus 1 characters remaining in the pattern, and for the previous characters of the pattern we have to look for the incoming vertices. So, whatever vertices are connected to vertex V, we have to look at all the incoming neighbors of vertex V and use those vertices to align the previous I minus 1 characters of the pattern. So, therefore, we are recursing back and we are saying to recurse back over all vertices where such that u comma v is a edge in the edge set. That is, in other words, we are considering all incoming neighbors of vertex V in the DAG. And finally, the last case where which is C I comma u plus 1. So, this is again corresponding to deletion in the pattern, and again we are penalizing cost of 1 for the deletion. So, this recursion is same as before, except that we have to look at the topology of the graph now, and we have to look at the incoming neighbors of the vertex to consider all the alignment paths, right. So, this is again remember that alignment can follow this path or alignment can follow this path. So, accordingly we are considering all possible incoming neighbors of vertex V. So, given this recursion, what we have seen is that if you see this dynamic programming table, on one axis you have pattern and on the top axis you have all the vertices of the DAG. While solving for CIV, basically from this recursion we have the following dependencies. So, depending on, so for this vertex the in degree is 2, accordingly we have the following dependencies, that is it is depending on the first top cell, then diagonal left cell, and also because of this incoming edge here it is also depending on these cells. So, that is the dependency structure which is determined by the topology of the DAG. Okay, so, now in what order should we fill this dynamic programming table? Well, for this remember that for DAGs, so when we have acyclic graphs we can do topological sorting of acyclic graphs. So, topological sorting is a linear ordering of vertices such that for every directed edge u comma v, vertex u comes before vertex v in the ordering. So, this is a well understood property of the DAGs, that we can derive a topological sorting order of any DAG such that if in the linear ordering if you consider any edge, let us say 2 to 3, then 2 will appear before 3 in the ordering. And for acyclic graphs such a ordering is guaranteed to exist. Now, why is this useful? Because this is useful because we can order these vertices using topological sort, and then we can solve this dynamic programming table row by row. So, that is to say we will fill the first row in the left to right manner, and observe that for each cell we would have already known the corresponding dependencies. Similarly, we will fill the second row, then we will fill the third row, and so on. So, we can fill this table row by row, and the runtime of this algorithm can be derived as following. So, for each row, observe that we are spending order v plus e time. So, here in each row you have exactly v cells to fill in each row, and to determine the score of each cell you are looking at incoming neighbors of that vertex. So, basically you can think of it this as you are touching each edge exactly once, right, and therefore, if you look at the amortized analysis over all row, then over all row we will be spending order v plus e time, because for each vertex we are looking at all the incoming vertices while filling the dependencies. So, this gives us order v plus e time for each row, and if you consider all rows, we have pattern length m. So, therefore, there will be m number of rows. So, this gives us the total runtime of this algorithm as m v plus e, right. So, this is how we can solve sequence to graph alignment problem when your graph is a DAG, that is the graph does not have any cycle. Now, can you guess if the graph was cyclic, what problem would occur? Why would the same algorithm not work for cyclic graphs? Well, let us discuss this in the next slides. So, let us move to the problem 2, where your input graph is a general graph that can also have cycles, right. So, same setting as before, we are considering eddy distance, we are only allowing changes in the pattern, and this time you have a graph, a general directed graph which can also contain cycles. So, let us move. So, now we can formulate the problem as following. You are given a Pangenome graph G V E sigma, and we want to determine if there is a walk in G such that the eddy distance between the strings spelled by the walk and the pattern is less than or equal to k. Now, we are using this term walk because it can also happen that the vertices can repeat in a walk, right. So, a walk can include a vertex more than once. So, it can happen that you have a pattern and you want to use a cycle and traverse it multiple times in the graph to align it with lower eddy distance. So, that is why instead of path we are using the term walk here. So, now we can apply the same concept that we were using for DAGs. We can define our sub problem in the same way, that is we want to solve for minimum eddy distance between the prefix of the pattern and text suffix in the graph which ends at vertex v. So, same idea as DAGs. We can use the same recursion as DAGs because this also remains correct. So, this recursion does not use the property that the graph has cycles or not. So, the same recursion still holds. The question is, how do we fill the dynamic programming table? Observe that now your graph has cycles. So, this vertex is connected to this is connected to this, and this is connected to this. So, there is a cycle here. Now, in the case of graph which has cycles, observe that topological sorting for a graph is not possible when the graph has cycles. So, getting that linear ordering where for each edge u comma v, u comes before v is not possible when you have cycles. So, you can think about it like if you have cycles and suppose your cycle contains vertices v1, v2, v3, then there is no way you can order these 3 vertices so that for each edge the source vertex appears before the destination vertex. So, this is easy to see that why topological sorting does not exist for cyclic graphs. Now, without the topological sorting, how do we solve this recursion? Because if we solve this row by row, Now what can happen is that when we are solving a particular element, it can happen that it depends on its some values that we have already computed, but it can also depend on some values that are not optimally computed so far. For example, it may depend on the value that is further ahead and which may not have been solved optimally. So because of this ordering issue, dynamic programming cannot be used directly. There has to be some modification in the ordering in which how we compute this matrix. So one option is we can order the vertices arbitrarily. Let us say we put them in any arbitrary order on the top, and let us say that we fill the table row by row in the same manner that we filled for the DAGs. Now observe that the issue that is occurring now is let us say that all the cost values for first I minus 1 rows have been optimally computed, and now we are computing the values corresponding to row I. So for the above values will be okay, because for all the above value that we are accessing from the previous row will be accessing them correctly, but when we are accessing the values in the same row, there we are not sure whether all those values have been computed optimally or not, because observe that CIV depends on the score at this vertex, and this score at vertex G depends on the vertex T, but the score at vertex T also depends on vertex G because of cycle. So because of this cyclic dependency, it is not easy to understand in what order should we compute these values. So for the above values it is fine, but for the values in the same row this is difficult. So one option we can use to address this issue is we can at each row we can update values iteratively until convergence. So what do I mean by that? Well, I can keep on applying this recursion again and again until I see the values converged. At some point the updates will stop, we can prove that. So even if you compute some intermediate values using the previous row, and then if we keep on applying this formula iteratively until the values converge, we can prove that the convergence will happen in finite number of iterations. So the idea is that we can, to address this cyclic dependency issue, we can compute the values of each row iteratively until convergence, and using some more theory we can argue that the runtime of this algorithm will remain same as the runtime of the DAGs. So the runtime of this algorithm is still order m v plus e, that is the pattern length on one axis. So you already have pattern on the one axis. So we are filling the values of all m rows, and so this matrix size is itself m times v, right, and because we are considering all the dependencies, so the runtime of this algorithm is m v plus e, and this iterative algorithm is not adding any additional overhead over the algorithm that we have used for DAGs. So to see the formal proof of this argument, I refer you to this paper where further analysis is done to show that how to do these iterations in a way such that the amortized cost of these iterations is not adding any additional overhead. So this is how we would do sequence alignment to graphs when the graph is a general graph that can contain cycles. So in summary, in this lecture we have looked at how do we do sequence to graph alignment problem, and that is useful when you want to map reads to a pangenome reference graph. So we have discussed only a handful of algorithms. In practice, because these graphs are very large, we would also need heuristics, because the exact algorithms have quadratic runtime complexity. So they depend on the pattern length as well as the graph size. So because of that, in practice software would also use many other heuristics, but this gives you an example of what additional challenge pangenome graphs bring. So when we are dealing with these graph structures compared to just a linear reference, there are additional algorithmic challenges that we have to address, and some of these problems are still under active research. So, for that I refer you to the review articles on Pangenome references. Thank you.